There is something quietly strange about the first image we ever get of Rick Grimes. He is lying in a hospital bed in rural Georgia, the machines around him long since gone silent. And when he eventually wakes up and stumbles out into a hallway that should be full of nurses and the ambient noise of a working building, the low-level hum of a place where people are being kept alive on purpose, there is nothing. The world has already happened without him. Whatever catastrophe erased everything, erased it while Rick Grimes was unconscious, while he was somewhere unreachable, and so he missed the end of one thing and woke up at the beginning of something else entirely. And what is quietly interesting, philosophically, is that he is still wearing the badge. He did not take it off. It is still there, clipped to his shirt right where it always was, as if some part of him, even unconscious, even abandoned in a hallway full of dried blood and overturned furniture, and the kind of silence that feels like it is made of something heavier than air, believed that what the badge represented still meant something, still applied, still said something true about who he was and what he was supposed to do. He is also wearing a wedding ring, and that detail matters too in a different way. The badge represents the agreement he made with his community, to protect people, to enforce the rules they had collectively decided to live by. The ring represents the agreement he made with one specific person, to stay, to be present, to build a life together. He carries both of these objects into the new world without thinking about it, without choosing to. They are just there, because they were always there, because Rick Grimes is someone who does not put things down easily. That image, the badge, the ring, the empty hallway, the man who woke up late, is the whole show in miniature. It is 11 seasons of television compressed into one quiet opening. A man carrying the artifacts of a vanished civilization into a world that has no use for them anymore, and spending every episode that follows deciding, quietly and repeatedly and at great personal cost, whether those artifacts still mean something, whether the things they represent are worth protecting, whether you can be a sheriff when there is no law, a husband when you have lost your wife, a father when the world your child is inheriting looks nothing like the one you promised to make safe for him. Tonight I want to think through what Rick Grimes actually believed, not just what he did, because the plot of The Walking Dead is well documented, and if you are here, you know it already, but what the choices he made over 11 seasons of television reveal about his philosophy, about how he understood morality and community and grief and power and mercy, because Rick Grimes is not just a protagonist, he is a philosophical argument. The show uses him, at its most thoughtful, to ask genuinely difficult questions about what it means to stay human when being human is the hardest and most costly option available. There are 12 things I want to think through with you tonight, and none of them are urgent. We have plenty of time. But before we begin, if you could just take a moment to subscribe, it is completely free, and it genuinely helps this channel more than you know. Anyway, that is enough of that. Let us get into it. Most post-apocalyptic stories begin after everything has already changed. That is the convention of the genre. You meet your protagonist in medias res, already adapted, already hardened, already operating according to the rules of the new world rather than the old one. The backstory is optional. The before is mostly irrelevant. What matters is the now, the survival, the threat directly in front of you. The Walking Dead is slightly different in this regard, and the difference matters more than it might seem at first, because the show gives us enough of Rick Grimes' former life through the cold open of the very first episode, through fragments and memories and the way he carries himself, through the conversations other characters have about who he was before, to understand that he was someone with a specific and deeply held conception of what was right and wrong before any of this started. We know the original, we know what is being tested, and that makes every test more interesting. Rick Grimes was a sheriff's deputy in King County, Georgia, small-town law enforcement in the American South, which means something specific. It means he organized his entire professional life around a set of values that were, at their core, about the relationship between individuals and the communities they belong to. A sheriff's job, at its most fundamental level, is to embody a community's agreement about how people should treat each other. It is to say, we have decided collectively that certain things are not acceptable, and someone has to be willing to enforce that decision, and that someone is me. Rick Grimes signed up for that job. He put on that badge every morning knowing that it represented an obligation, not just to follow orders, but to stand between people and whatever threatened them, whether that threat came from outside or from within. That is not a small thing. That is a specific philosophical commitment, made daily, made publicly, made in the full knowledge that the community is watching and that the badge is only as meaningful as the person wearing it makes it. Here is the thing about starting a post-apocalyptic story with a cop. A cop is already someone who has agreed, at some fundamental level, that there are rules worth enforcing even at personal cost. Not a philosopher by training, not someone who has spent years in seminars thinking about the nature of morality, but someone who has made an embodied, practical commitment to the idea that the way people treat each other matters, and that protecting the weak from the strong is a worthwhile thing to do with a life. Rick Grimes already had a philosophy before the dead walked. He just never had to examine it very closely, because the world he lived in mostly agreed with him. The cold open of the pilot episode, Days Gone By, gives us Rick in conversation with his partner, Shane Walsh, sitting in a patrol car outside a diner on a quiet Georgia road. It is a mundane conversation. Rick is talking about women, about relationships, about his marriage to Laurie, and the small frictions that accumulate in a long partnership. He is trying to understand something about the gap between how men and women communicate. He's not philosophical about it in any formal sense. He is just a man trying to figure out how to be a good husband, talking to his friend about it the way people do, and what that scene establishes, quietly and without drawing attention to itself, is that Rick Grimes takes promises seriously. He is bothered by the gap between what he intends and what he manages to communicate. He wants to get it right. He is the kind of person who thinks about whether he is doing right by the people he has committed to, and feels something when he suspects the answer might be no. Shane is also in that scene, and Shane is important here because he represents the philosophical alternative from the very beginning. Even in the pilot, before the world ends, Shane and Rick are different in a specific way. Shane is pragmatic in a way Rick is not quite. Shane thinks about outcomes. Shane thinks about what works. Rick thinks about those things too, but he also thinks about something underneath the outcomes, about the kind of person you're becoming in the process of getting to them. It is a subtle difference in that opening scene. It becomes the entire argument of the show within 2 seasons. Rick believed in institutions. That is perhaps the cleanest way to put it. He believed in the law, not because the law is always right. He was not naive. He had seen enough of law enforcement to know that systems are imperfect and that individual officers can be corrupt or wrong, but because the law represents something worth believing in, it represents the attempt to codify how people should treat each other, to give that codification some teeth, to build something that outlasts any individual person or moment. Rick Grimes was a man who had organized his life around the value of the attempt, even knowing the attempt is imperfect. That is a specific kind of faith, and it is worth understanding because it is the faith that the rest of the show will spend 12 seasons testing. He was shot in the line of duty before the pilot begins. That detail matters too. He did not just theoretically accept the risks of his job. He paid a real price for it. He was doing his work, protecting people, and something went wrong, and he ended up in a hospital bed, unconscious, while the world ended around him. There is something both tragic and philosophically significant about that sequence of events. Rick Grimes was injured doing precisely what he believed in doing, and the consequence of that injury was that he missed the collapse of everything those beliefs were attached to. He woke up to a world that no longer supported the framework his values were built on. And the question the show then spends 12 years asking is whether the framework survives without the support. Whether you can believe in law and community and the protection of the weak when there is no law and no community and the weak are dying faster than anyone can protect them. He had a wife. He had a young son. He had a partner he trusted. He had a community that looked to him in the small way that small communities look to the people whose job it is to look back. He had a life that made sense within the assumptions of the world he lived in. Think about what that means for everything that comes after. Think about what it means to carry a badge into a world where the institution that badge represents has dissolved entirely. To carry a wedding ring into a world that keeps taking people from you. To try to be a good father in a world that is actively hostile to the idea of childhood. Rick Grimes is not just a man trying to survive. He is a man trying to survive as the same person he was before, and discovering over and over again how much that costs, and deciding over and over again whether the cost is worth it. That is the philosophical project Rick Grimes is engaged in from the moment he wakes up in that hospital hallway. Not, how do I stay alive? That is the plot. The philosophical project is, who do I stay alive as? His pre-apocalypse self is not a character we lose in the pilot. It is a character we carry forward through every season. It is the measuring stick. Every version of Rick Grimes that the show subsequently produces has to be understood in relation to the original. The deputy, the husband, the man who took promises seriously and wore the badge every day and believed, quietly and without drama, that the way people treat each other is the most important thing in the world. That man does not disappear. He gets tested and broken and partially rebuilt and tested again, but he does not disappear. And that persistence, the stubborn continuity of the original Rick Grimes beneath all the damage, is what makes his story worth following. He is not a hero who is defined by capability. He is a person who is defined by commitment. And the show's most honest and interesting episodes are the ones that show you exactly how much that distinction costs. We will meet the new world through his eyes in a moment, but first it is worth sitting with the original just a little longer. The man who woke up in the hospital, the man with the badge and the ring and the ordinary problems of an ordinary life, because understanding who Rick Grimes was before everything changed is the only way to understand what everything he does afterward actually means. And here is the thing I find genuinely interesting about this, which is that Rick is not an unusual man. He is not a genius. He is not a trained philosopher or a military strategist or someone who was selected by fate or circumstance for the role of post-apocalyptic moral anchor. He is a moderately successful, small-town cop who took his job seriously and loved his family and probably had strong opinions about college football. The ordinariness is the point. The show is not arguing that Rick Grimes is exceptional in the way we usually mean that word. It is arguing that the values he holds, the ordinary, unglamorous values of someone who shows up, who follows through, who thinks about whether he is doing right by the people around him, are the things that matter most when everything else has been stripped away. There is a version of this story where the protagonist is a survivalist, someone who is already prepared, already trained, already adapted to a world without institutions or social infrastructure. The Walking Dead is deliberately not that story. It chose a sheriff's deputy from rural Georgia who was unconscious when the world ended and woke up knowing nothing. The choice is philosophical before a single line of dialogue is spoken. It is the show saying, the person best suited to navigate this is not the person who was most prepared for it. It is the person who had the right values and was willing to carry them even when carrying them became genuinely difficult. Rick Grimes' first act of violence in the New World is not self-defense in any conventional sense. He is not fighting for his life. He is not cornered. He is not reacting to an immediate threat. He is returning deliberately to something he has already seen and moved past because he cannot quite let it go. He has encountered a walker, a woman, or what used to be a woman, who has been reduced to half a body, dragging herself through the grass in a park. Her lower half simply gone, her eyes still blinking, her hands still reaching. She is not dangerous, she cannot get up. She's simply existing in a state of horrifying incompleteness, and Rick Grimes finds her and looks at her and then keeps moving. And then he comes back. He comes back with a weapon and he kneels near her and he says he is sorry, and then he puts her out of her suffering. That is where Rick Grimes begins, philosophically. Not with rage, not with self-preservation, not with the cold calculation of survival. He begins with pity, with the recognition that something deserving of mercy is suffering in front of him, and that he has the capacity to end that suffering, and that choosing not to would be a form of moral failure, even if no one is watching, and there is no institution left to enforce any standard of decency. He does the right thing when the right thing gains him nothing and costs him something. That is a specific kind of integrity, and the show establishes it in the first episode deliberately, because it wants you to know who this man is before you watch what the world does to him. The philosophical question the bicycle girl scene raises, and the show is rarely direct about raising it, which is part of what makes it interesting, is whether the dead still have moral status, whether the thing that used to be a person deserves anything from the people who are still alive. Most survival narratives answer this question quickly and move on. The dead are threats, not people. They are obstacles, not moral patience. You kill them or you die. Rick Grimes' answer, at least in the early seasons, is more complicated than that. He sees the former person in the walker. He extends something, not quite respect, not quite love, but something in the family of those things, to what remains. And that extension, that willingness to let himself be moved by suffering, even when the suffering belongs to something that is functionally dead, is one of the clearest windows into his moral character. It is not something he can maintain at scale. The show does not pretend otherwise. When you're surrounded by thousands of walkers, you cannot afford to pause and feel something about each one. The mercy that Rick extends to Bicycle Girl in the park in rural Georgia is a luxury of his early naivety, and the show knows that, and part of the story it is telling is about the slow erosion of that naivety under sustained pressure. But it is important that he starts here. It is important that the first moral choice the show gives him is this one, whether to return to something helpless and suffering when he does not have to. He returns. Every version of Rick Grimes that follows has to be understood in the shadow of that choice. The bar scene in Season 2 is a different kind of first kill, and it matters in a different way. The episode is Nebraska, and Rick, Herschel, and Glenn are in a bar, and two men come in. Their names are Dave and Tony. They are survivors like Rick. They are human, unlike the walkers. They are, on the surface, potential allies, people who have made it this far, who might have information, who might even be willing to cooperate. Rick sits with them and talks. He tries to make it work. He is still, at this point, someone who defaults to the assumption that people can be dealt with, that conversation is possible, that the human connections that exist between strangers are worth attempting even in a collapsed world. And then the conversation shifts. And Rick understands, in the way you understand certain things before you can fully articulate them, that Dave and Tony are not people he can work with. Not because they are violent. In a world like this, violence is often unavoidable, and Rick knows that. But because of the specific way they are violent, the specific absence in their moral framework. Dave and Tony have survived by being willing to do anything, and the anything they are willing to do does not have a flaw. They have built a life around the principle that nothing is off the table, and Rick can see that, and he can see what it means for the people he is responsible for. He kills them both, quickly, before either of them can act first. It is worth noting, as an aside, that Rick Grimes does not look like someone who just won a gunfight. He looks like someone who is doing a very unpleasant job that needed doing. There is no triumph in it. There is not even visible relief. He killed 2 people in a bar in rural Georgia, and now he has to figure out what to do about that. The show does not score this moment like an action beat. It scores it like a consequence. What the bar scene introduces is a distinction that becomes central to the show's philosophy. The distinction between necessary violence and arbitrary violence, between killing because you have to and killing because it's easier than dealing with the moral complexity of an alternative. Rick's kills in the bar are, by any honest reading, defensive. Dave reaches for his gun first. The violence was coming regardless. Rick's choice is only about who goes first and who does not come back. But the speed of it, the decisiveness of it, the absence of hesitation, these things are worth noting. Because they tell you that Rick Grimes has updated his understanding of what the world requires from him. He has not abandoned his moral framework. He has extended it to cover new territory. There is also something philosophically significant about how Rick processes these early kills. He does not take them lightly. The show takes considerable care to show this. The silences after, the way he carries the weight of them, the conversations he has with Herschel and Shane, and eventually with Carl about what it means to take a life. He does not become casual about violence. He does not develop the numbness that some of the show's characters develop. The way killing becomes just another task, another routine thing you do to keep moving. For Rick, every kill is accompanied by something, a residue, a cost. And that cost is part of what makes him interesting as a moral figure. He is someone for whom violence is always significant, even when it is also necessary. Shane's approach to the same moral terrain is worth considering here, because Shane is the show's clearest articulation of the alternative. Shane kills people too, and in the early seasons, he often kills with justification similar to Rick's. But Shane does not carry it the same way. Shane has arrived at a philosophical position, faster than Rick, with less resistance, that says the old rules do not apply. The old moral framework was appropriate for the old world, and the old world is gone, and what matters now is survival and nothing else. Shane is not a villain because he's wrong about the new world being brutal. He is a villain, to the extent that the show frames him as one, because he has decided that the brutality of the world absolves him of the obligation to remain human within it. The show is doing something quite specific in the first 2 seasons by keeping Rick and Shane in close proximity. It is giving us a controlled comparison. 2 men with similar backgrounds, similar training, similar access to information, similar exposure to the same horrors, and 2 fundamentally different responses to those horrors. Shane looks at what the world has become and concludes that the self is the only thing worth protecting. That sentiment is a liability, that the sooner you let go of the old values, the better your odds of surviving. Rick looks at the same world and concludes that the old values are the point. Not as a strategy for survival. He does not think caring about people will keep him safer. He is not naive about that, but as a statement about what he is willing to become in order to survive. That distinction, surviving with something intact versus surviving, is the philosophical engine the show runs on for 8 seasons. Shane resolves the question early and badly. Rick never fully resolves it, which is why he remains interesting. He is always in the middle of the negotiation between what the world requires and what he is willing to give it. Shane ended the negotiation by conceding everything. Rick refuses to concede the final thing, and that refusal is what the show's about. Rick never makes that decision, not fully, not finally, even at his most brutal, even in the moments where the show pushes him to the absolute edge of what a moral person can do and still be described as moral. Even there, he is still carrying something. He is still aware that what he is doing costs something. That awareness is not sufficient to make him good in any simple sense, but it is the thing that keeps him, barely and imperfectly, from becoming Shane. How a person treats their first kills, how much weight they give them, how long they carry them, whether they find ways to explain the weight away, or insist on feeling it anyway, tells you almost everything about what kind of person they will become under sustained pressure. Rick Grimes carries his. That is the beginning of the story. Everything that follows is a test of how long he can keep carrying them before the weight becomes too much, and what he does on the days when it almost is. Rick Grimes never wanted to be a leader. This is not a retrospective interpretation or a reading against the grain. It is documentable in the show's first season. He arrives at the camp outside Atlanta, the group of survivors assembled around Shane's pragmatic competence and Dale's quiet moral authority, and he tries to simply be a member. He has no agenda. He is not running for anything. He is a man who woke up alone in a hospital, walked until he found people, and was looking, in the most basic possible way, for somewhere to belong. He wanted to find his wife and his son, and then figure the rest out from there. And then, almost immediately, the group started looking to him. Not because he demanded it, not because he had any particular plan, but because he had the badge, literally and figuratively. And because there is something in the way Rick Grimes moves through a difficult situation that communicates, without words, that this is someone who has been trained to think about other people's safety as a primary obligation rather than an afterthought. The group did not vote. They did not deliberate. They just started deferring to him in the way that groups under stress sometimes defer to whoever seems most comfortable with the weight of decision. And Rick accepted it. Not eagerly, but honestly. He accepted the responsibility without performing reluctance and without inflating it into something grandiose. He just stepped into it and tried to figure out what it meant. What does it mean to be responsible for other people? That is the question the show is quietly asking from the moment Rick takes on any degree of leadership. And it is a question without a clean answer. It is a question that the show's various antagonists all answer differently, and that Rick's own answer to keeps changing as the world keeps changing around him, and that the show never fully resolves because it is not a question that admits resolution. It is a question you live with. Rick's early philosophy of the group is essentially democratic in its instincts, even if it is never formally democratic in its structure. He wants people to have a say. He wants decisions to be made collectively. He pushes back against the idea that leadership means one person's judgment overrides everyone else's, and in the early seasons especially, he is genuinely trying to operate as a first among equals rather than as an authority in any traditional sense. Think about what that means given his background. He has spent his professional life in a hierarchical institution, taking orders and giving them in a clear chain of command. He knows how authority works. He chooses not to replicate it when he has the opportunity to build something different. That choice turns out to be harder to maintain than he understood when he made it. The moment the show frames most explicitly as a philosophical rupture is what has been called the Rick-tatorship. Rick's declaration, at the end of Season 2, that they are no longer operating as a democracy. The circumstances that produce this declaration are specific and worth understanding. He has just come through the loss of Laurie. He is fractured in ways that are not yet fully visible. He is running on a kind of reserve energy that is more adrenaline than anything else. And he is facing a group that keeps needing decisions made quickly, that keeps looking to him for answers. He is not always sure he has, and he simply does not have the bandwidth anymore to manage the process of democratic deliberation alongside everything else. The Rick-tatorship speech is not triumphalist. It is not a power grab. It is a man who is barely holding together, telling people the truth about his capacity. He is saying, I cannot do this the way I wanted to do it. I cannot hold the space for everyone's input and also keep us alive at the rate that keeping us alive is currently requiring. And then he just stops. He walks away. He does not wait for a response. Because he's not asking for feedback. He is just telling them how things are going to be. I always find that moment difficult to watch, and I think the difficulty is the point. We have spent 2 seasons watching Rick try to do the right thing, And now we are watching him give up on one version of the right thing because he does not have the resources for it anymore. It is not a villain turn, but it is a loss. And the show knows it is a loss. It does not score the dictatorship speech with music that makes it feel powerful or decisive. It just lets it sit there, uncomfortable, in the way that honest things sometimes are. What makes that moment philosophically significant is not that Rick becomes authoritarian. He does not really, not in the way the governor is authoritarian, not in the way Negan is authoritarian. What makes it significant is that it reveals the limits of his original idealism. He wanted a certain kind of community. He believed in the value of collective decision-making, and the world ground that belief down, gradually, and then all at once, until he did not have the resources to maintain it anymore. That is not a character flaw, that is an honest depiction of what sustained crisis does to good intentions. The comparison to other leadership models that the show presents throughout its run is instructive. The governor runs Woodbury on the principle that stability requires absolute control, that the appearance of normalcy is worth almost any price, including the systematic deception and brutalization of the people you are supposedly protecting. Negan runs the Saviors on the principle that hierarchy is not just inevitable, but honest, that the strong should take from the weak, and that calling this a system at least has the virtue of acknowledging what it is. And various smaller factions operate on various combinations of these principles, all of them in implicit conversation with what Rick is trying to build. Rick's philosophy, by contrast, is messier and less satisfying as a system, but more honest about what it is trying to do. He is not trying to create stability at any cost. He is not trying to impose a hierarchy that benefits himself. He is trying to build something that is actually worth having. A community that operates according to values that the people in it have some say in, that treats its members as people rather than as resources, that is oriented towards something beyond mere survival. That is a harder thing to build and a harder thing to maintain, and the show is consistently honest about how often he fails at it and how much those failures cost. The vote at Herschel's farm about whether to keep Randall alive, in the Season 2 episode, Judge, Jury, Executioner, is a microcosm of the whole problem. The group has captured a young man who was part of a hostile group, and the question is what to do with him. Let him go and risk him leading enemies back. Kill him and accept the moral cost. The group talks about it, argues about it, and cannot agree. And what the argument reveals is that the group does not have shared values yet. They have shared geography and shared immediate threat, but they have not yet worked out what they believe about the relationship between safety and morality, between protecting the group and respecting individual lives. Rick tries to hold the space for that argument. He fails because the argument is too hard and the stakes are too immediate, and the group does not have the philosophical foundations yet to resolve it. Dale is the one who advocates most clearly for Randall's life. And Dale's advocacy is interesting because it is not strategic. He does not argue that keeping Randall alive is the safest option. He argues that killing him would change the group in ways that cannot be undone. That the willingness to execute someone helpless and restrained is not just a one-time decision, but a declaration about what kind of people they are becoming. He is right about this. The group knows he is right, and they proceed anyway, or try to, until circumstances intervene. Dale's death shortly after, unrelated to Randall, just the brutal randomness of the world, removes the group's most consistent moral voice at precisely the moment they most needed it. Rick carries that loss too, though less visibly than the later ones. The show does not dwell on it in the way it dwells on Herschel, but the absence of Dale's consistent moral pressure is felt in the seasons that follow. Rick becomes the person who has to make the argument that Dale used to make, and he is less well suited for it, less patient, less articulate in the specific register of principled objection, more prone to the pragmatic override. He misses Dale in the way you miss someone who was doing something for you that you did not fully realize you needed. Rick's difficulty integrating into Alexandria in Season 5 and 6 is philosophically revealing in a different way. Alexandria is a functioning community, walled, organised, with electricity and running water and people who have been living something approaching a normal life, while Rick's group was in the wilderness. It should be exactly what Rick was trying to build, and his response to it is distrust, barely concealed aggression, and the inability to down-regulate from the threat assessment mode that the previous years have trained him into. What that reveals is something worth holding, that the experience of sustained danger does not just change what you believe, it changes what you're able to feel. Rick cannot experience safety as safety anymore, at least not immediately. His body has learned to treat safety as a lie, and his mind has learned to agree. The thing he has been building toward has arrived, and he cannot let himself believe in it. That is the cost of what sustained leadership under sustained threat extracts. It does not just change your philosophy, it changes your nervous system. He was responsible for Laurie, for Carl, for Daryl, who had chosen to stay when he did not have to, for Glenn, who had given his trust to a group of strangers and gotten it back, for Herschel, who had offered his farm when he did not have to, for every person who had looked at Rick Grimes across a difficult moment and decided quietly and without a formal election that he was the one who would decide. That weight accumulates, and the show is honest about the accumulation, about the fact that being responsible for other people changes you, that it takes things from you, that the person who comes out the other side of sustained leadership under sustained pressure is not the same person who went in. Rick's philosophy of the group is not consistent across the series. It evolves sometimes in ugly directions. There are moments where his gatekeeping of who gets to belong is troubling, where his certainty about who deserves protection and who does not is not as carefully considered as it might be. There are moments where the Rick-tartership is not just a practical necessity, but a genuine abdication of the values he started with. The show does not smooth these inconsistencies over. It presents them and lets them stand, because inconsistency under pressure is honest. It is what actually happens to convictions when the world will not cooperate with them. That inconsistency is not a failure of character writing. It is the point. The governor is not presented as simply evil, at least not at first. And that matters more than it might seem, because if he were just evil, if he were a straightforwardly monstrous person whose cruelty was unmotivated and whose power was only explicable as villainy, he would not function as a philosophical challenge to Rick. He would just be an obstacle. The show is more interesting than that. Philip Blake, who calls himself the governor, has built something. Woodbury is a town with electricity and walls and organised food production and the social texture of a functioning community. People who know each other's names, children who are growing up in something that resembles safety, a sense that life has resumed in some form. When Michonne and Andrea arrive there, the contrast with what they have been living in is stark and immediate. This is not just a camp. This is a town, and the show is honest enough to let that register before it shows you the seams. There is something genuinely attractive about what the governor has made, and the philosophical question the show asks through Woodbury is whether the attractiveness can be separated from the methods. Whether you can have the electricity and the walls and the sense of normalcy without also having the arena, the deception, the systematic brutality that maintains the governor's control. The show's answer is no, but the fact that it asks the question at all is significant. The governor's philosophical position is, at its most charitable, this: civilization requires order. Order requires authority. Authority requires someone willing to do what is necessary to maintain it. And the definition of necessary in a world like this one expands considerably, and you can either pretend otherwise and fail, or accept the expansion and succeed. He is not entirely wrong about the underlying logic. Stability does require authority. Authority is, in some circumstances, maintained through fear. The question is not whether these things are true, but what kind of society is built on top of them, and what it costs the people inside it. Rick's implicit counter-argument, and it is mostly implicit, mostly enacted rather than stated, is that the way you build a community determines what that community is. That a society built on fear and systematic deception is not civilization in any meaningful sense. It is a more comfortable tyranny. It gives people safety from the dead, while making them unsafe from each other, from the authority that is supposed to protect them. The people of Woodbury are not free. They are managed. And Rick's belief, which is the belief that organizes his entire approach to leadership, is that managed people are not the same as protected people. The arena scenes are where the show makes this argument most visibly. Woodbury has gladiatorial combat as entertainment. Walkers fighting each other, walkers fighting people, people fighting people, all staged for the crowd's enjoyment and designed to discharge aggression and build social solidarity around a shared spectacle of violence. And it works in the narrow sense that things like this sometimes work. The crowd is engaged, the tension releases, people feel like part of something. This is not a new idea. It has been working since at least the Romans. And I think the show deserves credit for not pretending the governor invented it, or that it is uniquely villainous. What is uniquely villainous is that the governor uses it while telling his people that they are civilized, that they are better than the chaos outside, that what he has built is something worth protecting. The arena and the speech about civilization cannot both be true. The governor knows this. The audience is not supposed to. The parallel between Rick and the governor is one the show constructs deliberately and then lets the audience sit with. Both men are willing to do terrible things to protect their people. Both men make decisions that result in deaths. Both men have sacrificed pieces of their original moral framework to the demands of the world they're living in. Both men have built walls and armed their communities and accepted that survival requires a certain amount of violence that their former selves would not have been comfortable with. The difference is in what they are protecting people for and what they are willing to sacrifice to do it. The governor is protecting people so that they will keep following him, so that the structure that keeps him in power will continue to function, so that the illusion of normality will persist long enough for him to remain in control. Rick is protecting people because he believes, genuinely, without calculation, that the people themselves are the point. Not the structure, not the stability, the people. Michonne sees the governor clearly from the first moment. Her intuition about him is correct and immediate, and the show spends several episodes in season 3 showing the gap between Andrea's reading and Michonne's, between the person who is fooled by the form of civilization and the person who sees through it to the substance underneath. What Michonne's clarity reveals is something worth thinking about. That intuition and institutional trust are not the same thing, and that sometimes the most honest reading of a situation comes from the person who is least invested in finding it acceptable. The negotiation scene between Rick and the governor, two men sitting across from each other in an empty building somewhere between their two communities, ostensibly trying to find a version of coexistence that neither of them actually believes in, is one of the show's most revealing conversations. Not because of what is said, but because of what is not said. Both men know the other is not offering peace. Both men are buying time, assessing strength, figuring out what the other person is actually willing to do. The conversation is a performance of diplomacy over a foundation of mutual recognition that diplomacy is not really what is happening, and Rick's willingness to sit across from the governor and maintain the performance is itself a philosophical choice, a decision that the possibility of avoiding conflict, however slim, is worth the cost of engaging with someone he knows to be dangerous. He has chances to simply end the governor. He does not take them. This is frequently read as weakness or naivety, and that reading is not unreasonable, but there is something else in it too. Rick's persistent, sometimes unreasonable, sometimes costly belief that the alternative to violence is worth attempting even when the odds are against it. That belief will become much more explicit and much more examined in the Negan arc, but it is already present here, already guiding him in ways that he could not fully articulate if you asked him to. The governor's final assault on the prison is the show's verdict on his philosophy. He brings a tank through the fence. He decapitates Herschel in front of the people who loved him. He destroys the thing that Rick built with the most care and the most genuine hope, and he does it with a kind of casual totality that reveals what his philosophy has always been beneath the civility. That nothing Rick believes in is real, that the only thing that matters is power and who holds it, that community and morality and the shared attempt to build something worth having are all just fictions that the weak tell themselves. And he is wrong, but the evidence of his wrongness costs more than it should. The conventional reading of the governor is that he is a monster, and he is. But the more interesting reading is that he is Rick without restraint. He is what Rick could become if he decided that the ends were sufficient justification for the means. If he let go of the belief that how you build something determines what it is. The governor is a mirror, and the show makes Rick look into it repeatedly. And the question the show is always asking through that confrontation is what Rick sees when he looks. There is a scene in the early part of Season 4 that does not get talked about as much as it deserves to. Rick Grimes is in a garden. Inside the prison, he has put down his gun, not because the threat is gone, because the threat is never entirely gone, but as a deliberate, considered choice to step back from the role of the man with the weapon and try to be something else for a while. He is growing vegetables. The dead are still pressed against the fences. The world outside is still what it is. But Rick has decided, quietly and without announcement, that he is going to try to grow something. That he is going to try to make something that lasts longer than the immediate crisis. That image, Rick Grimes with his hands in the dirt, surrounded by fences and walkers, growing food, is the prison as a philosophical statement in its most compressed form. The prison itself is, as a symbol, almost impossibly rich. It is a place built to confine people, to remove them from society, to hold them in place against their will. And the show repurposes it as the opposite of all those things. A place to protect people, to give them freedom of movement within a safe boundary, to hold the outside world at bay rather than holding its inhabitants captive. That inversion is deliberate, and the show knows it. The thing designed to imprison has become the thing that liberates, at least in the limited sense that anything can be liberating in a world like this one. The prison is Rick's most sustained attempt to build something genuine, not just a camp, not just a way station, but a real community with real structure and real hope for something beyond immediate survival. He establishes a council, a distributed governance system where multiple people share the responsibility for collective decisions rather than one person bearing it alone. He tries to step back from the dictatorship and restore something closer to his original instincts about shared leadership. He creates systems for managing the herd, for maintaining the fences, for keeping people occupied and purposeful. He plants a garden. Herschel Green is the philosophical soul of this period, and it is worth spending time with his role. Herschel is the person in the group who argues most persistently and most consistently for hope. Not hope as naivety, not hope as the refusal to see what is actually happening, but hope as a discipline, the active, daily choice to believe that what you build matters even in the absence of any guarantee that it will last. Herschel has his own complicated relationship with faith, and the show does not elide the complications, but what his faith produces in practical terms is an insistence on trying, on planting things even when you do not know if you will be here to harvest them, on treating people as people even when treating them as people is costly and inconvenient. Herschel is the voice that keeps gently correcting Rick when Rick's exhaustion or grief or fear drives him towards something harder and more closed. The illness arc in Season 4 is, I think, one of the most underrated stretches of the entire series. And it is underrated specifically because it does not have a human villain. A flu-like virus moves through the prison population. People are quarantined, resources get allocated, decisions get made about who is well enough to help and who needs help. And these decisions are not dramatic in the way that fighting the governor is dramatic. There is no one to shoot, no threat to outrun. There is just a community trying to figure out what it owes to its most vulnerable members, and doing so under conditions where every act of care is also a potential vector for harm. Rick is not the centre of this arc the way he is the centre of most of the show. He is one person in a community that is struggling with something larger than any individual's decisions, and that, the moment where Rick is not the protagonist but just a member, is one of the most honest pictures of what he was actually trying to build. A thing that works without him at the centre of it. And then the governor brings a tank through the fence. There is a way to describe what happens in Too Far Gone that involves the plot, the negotiation that fails, the attack that follows, the deaths and the chaos, and the dispersal of the group across the countryside. But the philosophical description is simpler. The thing Rick built with the most care is taken from him by someone who does not believe that careful building is real. The governor looks at the prison and sees an asset to be seized. Rick looks at the prison and sees an argument that there are things worth trying to build, that the attempt has value even when it fails, that community is not just a survival strategy, but an end in itself. The governor destroys the argument. He destroys Herschel, who was the argument's most eloquent defender. He destroys the garden and the council, and the systems that Rick spent months putting in place. He reduces everything to rubble and disperses the people, leaving Rick alone and barely breathing in the ruins of what he made. Rick crawls out of the wreckage of the prison, holding the hand of a son who is also barely breathing. That image, two people who should not still be alive, still moving, still holding on, is the show's most honest image of what Rick Grimes is. He does not stop, even when everything he built is gone. Even when the argument has been dismantled and the people who helped him make it are dead or scattered, he keeps moving. He keeps holding on. That is what the prison was, underneath the concrete and the fences and the dead pressed against the wire. It was an argument that something worth building was worth defending, and that even when you lose it, the fact of having tried it changes what comes next. Rick will spend the rest of his time in the show looking for another place to make that argument. He will find it imperfectly and at great cost, but he will find it. The prison taught him that he is capable of building. The loss of it taught him that building again after loss is the only thing the argument actually requires. Rick Grimes does almost everything he does because of Carl, not always consciously, not always in ways he could articulate if you sat him down and asked him directly. But the shape of his choices, the places where he pulls back from the edge, the moments where he tries rather than gives up, the decisions where he insists on being something more than just the strongest and most ruthless person in the room, all of them have Carl's fingerprints on them. Carl is not just Rick's son. Carl is Rick's reason. And the show spends 8 seasons exploring what happens to a man when his reason is also a person who is growing and changing and forming his own ideas about the world, a person who sometimes disagrees with him, a person who quietly and over time becomes the one trying to protect his father's humanity rather than the other way around. Carl comes into the new world as a young boy with very limited understanding of what is happening. That is obvious, and the show does not pretend otherwise. But Carl's development across the series is not simply a matter of the show aging a character in real time. It is a philosophical arc in its own right. Carl starts as the person who needs to be protected. He ends as the person who is most clearly articulating what the future should look like and why. The shooting of Shane in Season 2 is a hinge moment for Carl's character. that does not get discussed as often as it should. Shane has become a genuine threat, not just to Rick, but to the possibility of the kind of community Rick is trying to build. He has killed someone who was not a threat to him. He has manipulated and deceived and maneuvered his way to a breaking point. And when Rick and Shane's confrontation reaches its conclusion in the dark of a field in Georgia, it is Rick who ends it. But it is Carl who makes sure it stays ended. A boy shoots the man who was threatening his father. A boy who is not yet a teenager pulls a trigger to protect his family. What Rick does and does not say to Carl afterward matters. He does not comfort him by minimizing what happened. He does not tell him it was fine or easy or that it did not count somehow. He sits with the weight of it alongside his son, and that shared weight, the acknowledgement that what Carl did was real and that real things cost something, is one of the most honest parenting moments in the show. Carl's friendships with people outside the group become philosophically significant in the later seasons. His willingness to extend trust to strangers, to advocate for people that Rick and the other adults have written off, to insist that the future requires a different set of assumptions than the present. These are not just character quirks, they are a philosophical position. Carl has grown up in the apocalypse, which means he does not have the same attachment to the old world's norms that the adults do. He is not trying to rebuild what was lost. He is trying to build something new, and the something new he is trying to build starts from the premise that more people deserve to be inside the circle than the survival logic of the present allows. In Season 8, Carl meets a man named Siddiq, a stranger, alone, almost certainly dangerous, in the statistical sense that all strangers are dangerous in this world, and chooses to help him. Chooses to bring him in. Rick finds out and is not initially supportive. This is the dynamic in miniature. The father who has learned that the world punishes openness. The son who insists that the future requires it anyway. Neither of them is simply wrong, but the show is doing something specific in that disagreement, which is showing you two different philosophical responses to the same world. The pragmatism of experience and the idealism of someone who has not yet been made to give up on it. Carl's death in Season 8 is the show's most devastating narrative choice, and not just in emotional terms. It is devastating philosophically, because Carl is the show's most explicit articulation of what the future is supposed to be for. He is dying from a bite he received while helping Siddiq, which means his death is directly connected to his insistence on opening the circle, on trusting someone when the math did not support trusting. The show does not present this as a punishment for naivety. It presents it as a tragedy in the specific sense that the best thing about someone was the thing that cost them. The letter Carl leaves for Rick and the vision sequence the show constructs around it is the closest the show gets to a formal philosophical document. Carl's ask of his father is not tactical. It is not a list of instructions for surviving the war. It is a vision of what comes after, of the kind of world that is worth surviving for, of the people who ought to be inside it. He asks his father to make it better, to show him, to be the person capable of building the future that Carl will not be alive to see. Think about what that means for everything Rick does in the episodes and seasons that follow. He is not just trying to survive, he is trying to be worthy of a dead child's belief in him. He is trying to make his choices according to a standard that Carl set, a standard of mercy and openness, and the stubborn insistence that more people deserve to be inside the circle than the survival math usually allows. That standard does not make him less effective as a leader or less capable of violence when violence is necessary, but it changes the orientation of everything he does. It gives his survival a purpose that is larger than his own continued existence. You spend 8 seasons watching Rick Grimes try to protect his son, and then quietly, the show reveals that his son has been trying to protect him. That reversal is the most emotionally honest thing the show does, and it lands differently once you understand that Carl was not just a character, but a philosophical position. the argument that the future is worth building, that mercy is a requirement rather than a luxury, that the circle should be larger than the survival logic of any given moment allows. When Carl dies, Rick does not get to put down that argument. He has to carry it without the person who made it. That is the weight the show places on him in the final seasons, and understanding that weight is the only way to understand why the choices he makes in those seasons mean what they do. Before we move on, if you are enjoying this, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The boxcar at Terminus is a specific kind of dark, not the darkness of a bad situation getting worse, which the show produces constantly and which the audience has learned to metabolize. This is a different kind. Rick Grimes and the people he loves have been herded into a train car by people who have been eating other people, and the situation is, by any rational assessment, close to hopeless. They have no weapons, they have no plan. The people outside the car are numerous and organized and have clearly done this before. And Rick says quietly, with complete conviction, that the people who put them in here are going to feel very sorry. It is not a threat in any conventional sense. He is not performing bravado for the benefit of the people listening. He sounds like someone stating an observable fact about the near future. The way you might say it is going to rain tomorrow if you have looked at the clouds and know how clouds work. He is not afraid. He is something past fear, something that is hard to name and maybe should be. And then he says something that has been building for 4 seasons. He says they do not know who they are screwing with, and he is not wrong, but the show is quietly raising a question underneath the triumph of that line. Does he know who he is anymore? The arc that leads to and through Terminus is the show's most sustained examination of what happens when a moral person is pushed to the absolute limit of what they can endure and still function. Rick has lost Laurie. He has lost the prison. He has lost the specific prison. He has lost the specific version of himself that was able to plant a garden and run a council and try to build something with care and patience. He has been on the road with just Carl, then with a gradually reassembling group. And the road has been hard in the way that this show's roads are always hard, which is to say, harder than any reasonable person should have to absorb. The Claimers are the philosophical antagonist of this section of the story, and they are worth understanding carefully. Joe and his group have built a coherent moral system, which is more than can be said for a lot of what the show presents. Their system is simple. If you claim something, it is yours. If someone violates a claim, there is a specific and enforced consequence. The rule is consistent and understood and applied without exception. In certain respects, this is more of a functioning moral system than some of what Rick has been trying to build, which is messier and more contested and does not resolve disputes as cleanly. The problem with the Claimers system is that it has no flaw. It organises around possession and dominance and nothing else. There is no place in it for the person who is not in a position to claim, no protection for vulnerability, no obligation to anyone who is not already inside the circle of mutual enforcement. It is a moral system that works for everyone who is strong and for no one who is not. And Rick, whose entire moral formation has been oriented around the protection of the weak, cannot live inside that system. Not because he is too gentle for it. He is not. He has never been simply gentle, but because the thing the system would require him to sacrifice is the thing that makes him who he is. The scene in the van with the Claimers the night that Joe's group catches up to Rick and Carl and Michonne and Daryl is the show at its most visceral and its most honest about what Rick has become. A man threatens Carl, and Rick bites through a man's throat with his teeth to stop it. It is the single most extreme act of violence the show gives him, and it is given without any surrounding apparatus of justification or processing or reflection. There is only the threat, and then the response, and then the silence afterward. Rick does not explain himself. He does not feel visible remorse. He did what was necessary, and it is done. This is not the man who came back to put down Bicycle Girl in the park because he felt something about her suffering. Or rather, It is that man. But that man after everything that the show has put between them. That man after Laurie and the prison and the road and the accumulated weight of everything that has been taken. He still acted to protect. He still acted in response to a specific threat to specific people he loves. But the form the protection took has changed so dramatically that the original shape is barely visible underneath it. The "We are the walking dead" line, which comes from Robert Kirkman's comic and makes its way into the show in a slightly different context, is the philosophical statement of this arc. It is the acknowledgement that the distinction between the living and the dead is less fixed than it appears, that the process of surviving in this world changes people in ways that are not entirely reversible, that what you lose in the act of surviving is not always visible the way a physical wound is visible, but is no less real for that. I think this is the most honest thing the show ever says about itself. It is acknowledging that the zombies are not really the subject. They never were. They are the pressure that reveals things about people, about communities, about what survives when everything convenient and comfortable has been stripped away. Rick Grimes is interesting not because of what he does to walkers, which is mostly just shoot them. He is interesting because of what being the person who has to shoot them does to him. The "We are the walking dead" line is the show saying, yes, we know. We see it. We have been watching it happen to him the whole time. Rick is not the walking dead in any literal sense. He is not a walker. He is not dead. But the show is asking, in this arc, whether the version of Rick that went into the apocalypse is still entirely present in the version that comes out the other side of Terminus. What has survival cost him? What is still there? What is gone? This is not a question the show resolves cleanly. What it does instead is show you Rick arriving at Alexandria, a functioning community with walls and electricity and people who have not experienced what he has experienced. And it shows you how alien that community is to him, how loud his threat assessment runs in a place that does not have the same density of threat that he has been living in, how long it takes him to downregulate, how much of him has been reconfigured by sustained danger in ways that do not simply reconfigure back when the danger lifts. He walked through the most brutal period of his story and came out the other side still moving. That is not a small thing, but the show is honest about what moving through it cost him, and about the fact that the person who comes out the other end of this arc is carrying something the person who went in did not have. Something heavy, something that will shape everything that follows. The Terminus arc does not resolve the philosophical question it raises. It marks the place where a line is crossed. What Rick becomes on the other side of that line is someone who has to decide, repeatedly and deliberately, whether the crossing defines him or whether it is something he can carry without being consumed by. That choice, whether to be consumed or to carry, is what the remaining seasons are about. Negan does not hate Rick Grimes. This is important to establish clearly, because the temptation is to read their relationship as straightforward enmity, two leaders on opposing sides of a war, each wanting the other destroyed. That is the plot. But the philosophy running underneath the plot is more interesting than that. By the logic of Negan's own worldview, Rick is exactly the kind of person Negan respects and wants on his side. Rick is strong, demonstrably capable, loyal to his people to a degree that goes beyond rational self-interest, and able to make difficult decisions without flinching. Negan has built his entire system on the idea that the strong should lead and the weak should follow, and Rick is clearly, by any measure, Negan uses to assess strength, someone who qualifies. The problem is not that Rick is weak. The problem is that Rick refuses to accept Negan's premise. Negan's premise is this: power is the only honest currency in the world after everything collapsed. Everyone is operating under power dynamics, whether they admit it or not. Every community that gives tribute to the saviors is doing so because the saviors have more force than they do. But communities that pretend to govern themselves by consent are also operating under power dynamics. They are just less honest about who is actually in charge, and what would happen if anyone seriously challenged it. Negan's claim is that his system at least has the virtue of clarity. He is the most powerful. The most powerful takes from everyone else. The everyone else gets protection in exchange. That is the deal. Nothing is hidden. There is something philosophically uncomfortable about the fact that Negan's analysis is not entirely wrong. Power dynamics do exist in all human communities, including the ones that present themselves as democratic or egalitarian. Someone is always making final decisions. Someone is always benefiting more than others from the arrangements that are in place. Negan is not lying about the existence of hierarchy. He is lying, or at least deeply mistaken, about the claim that acknowledging hierarchy is the same as having an ethical system. Naming what you're doing does not make it right. Honesty about exploitation does not convert exploitation into something else. I want to sit with the saviour communities for a moment, because the show is more honest about them than it gets credit for. The sanctuary is not just a place of fear and misery. There are people there who have enough to eat, who have shelter, who have some measure of safety in a world that otherwise offers almost none of those things. The tribute system is brutal. Communities give half of what they produce to Negan's people, but the people who give tribute are alive to resent it. There is a version of the Negan argument that goes, I have fed people who would have starved. I have protected people who would have been killed. The accounting is ugly, but the math is not wrong. Rick's counterclaim is that this math misses something essential. That the question is not only whether people are alive, but what they are living for and what they are living as. A community that stays alive by learning that resistance is futile, that someone else's decisions are final, that their own judgments and voices and choices do not matter, that community has been kept alive, but has had something taken from it that survival figures cannot capture. Rick would not be able to put this in the clean terms I am using here, because Rick is not someone who reaches for abstract language. But his actions make the argument clearly enough. He keeps trying to build the other thing, the messier, less stable, more expensive thing, because the other thing produces people who are actually alive in the sense that matters. Rick's counterclaim is harder to articulate, which is why the show mostly enacts it rather than states it directly. But the shape of it becomes clear across the seasons. He believes that a community built on fear is not actually a community in any meaningful sense, that the people of the sanctuary are not thriving or protected or genuinely safe. They are managed. That the difference between management and protection is the difference between a system that treats its members as means and a system that treats them as ends, and that this difference is not just moral but practical. Managed people do not invest in what they are managing. They look for exits. They comply until compliance stops being the path of least resistance. The saviour system is always one credible challenge away from collapse, because it has no loyalty beneath the surface of the power arrangement. Rick is trying to build something with loyalty underneath, something that would hold even if the strongest person were suddenly gone. The murder of Glenn Rhee and Abraham Ford at the beginning of Season 7. In the first episode, The Day Will Come When You Won't Be, is the show's most extreme act of calculated cruelty, and it is designed specifically to make the philosophical argument concrete. Negan is not just killing two people, he is demonstrating a principle. He is teaching Rick's group the fundamental lesson of his system, that resistance is futile, and that the cost of resistance is borne by the people you love, rather than by you. It is an argument about power made in the most visceral and irreversible way possible. What the show then does, slowly, painfully, across 2 seasons, is follow Rick through the process of deciding what his response to that argument should be, whether to accept it, which is what Negan wants, and which would mean Rick internalizing Negan's premise, whether to refuse it immediately, which is what the emotional response demands, and which would mean more people dying before he has the capacity to win, or whether to do something harder, to wait, to build, to find the strength for a response that is not just reactive, but deliberate and oriented towards something specific about what comes after. Rick chooses the third option, not immediately, not without enormous internal cost, but eventually. And what makes it interesting philosophically is that the orientation toward what comes after is explicitly Carl's influence. Carl's vision of the future, the one articulated in his letter and in the way he talked about Siddiq and in every conversation he had about the people who ought to be inside the circle, becomes Rick's mandate. He is not just trying to win the war, he is trying to win it in a way that makes the future Carl described possible. The conclusion of the war, Rick slashing Negan's throat, and then immediately ordering his doctors to save him, is the moment that generated the most argument among the show's audience, and it is worth thinking about why. The surface reading is inconsistency. Rick could have ended it, he chose not to. It seems like weakness dressed up as principle. The deeper reading is that Rick is making the most deliberate philosophical choice of his entire story. He is choosing what the future looks like. He is choosing mercy, specific, costly, against his every instinct, because the alternative is to become the thing he has been fighting against, because a future built on the execution of the defeated is a Negan future, just with different people in charge. Carl asked him to make it better, to show him what better looks like. And Rick, at the most difficult possible moment, in the most difficult possible way, tries to do exactly that. Whether it works is another question. Whether it was the right choice is a question the show itself does not definitively resolve. But what it was, unambiguously, is Rick Grimes acting in accordance with his philosophy rather than his anger, which is, after everything the show has put him through, an extraordinary thing to witness. Before we move on, if you are enjoying this, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Mercy is an unusual word for The Walking Dead to reach for. It is not the word you expect in a show about the end of the world, a show whose visual vocabulary is blood and fences and the sound of walkers pressing against barriers. It is not the word you expect from a man who has, by the time the later seasons arrive, done things that exist in the outer reaches of what can be described as morally defensible. But Rick keeps returning to it. Not kindness, mercy. Those are not the same thing. Kindness is a personality trait. Mercy is a practice. It is the active, deliberate, effortful choice to extend grace beyond what is owed or required by any calculation of self-interest or justice. The distinction matters because Rick is not, by the later seasons, a kind man in any simple sense. He is not warm with strangers. He is not gentle by default. He does not meet new people with openness. What he is, and this is the thing the show's trying to be honest about, is a man who keeps choosing mercy anyway, despite the evidence that mercy is expensive and not always repaid and sometimes actively punished by the world he lives in. The pattern of Rick extending mercy and paying a price for it runs through the series. He leaves enemies alive who return as future threats. He extends trust that is later violated. He opens the circle when the pragmatic calculus says to keep it closed, and people die because he did. The show does not let him off the hook for these choices. It does not present mercy as always wise or always successful. It shows you the costs clearly and consistently, and then it shows you Rick choosing mercy again, after the costs, with full knowledge of them. That repetition is the show's argument. Not that mercy is strategically optimal. It often is not. Not that mercy always produces good outcomes. It does not. But that mercy is the practice that distinguishes a community from a pack. That it is what makes the thing Rick is building different from the thing Negan has built. That without it, the future Carl was describing becomes impossible. Herschel Green is the character who makes this argument most persistently and most clearly. He argues for mercy in situations where the math does not support it. He argues for the value of trying, for the obligation to people who are suffering and helpless. for the belief that the way you treat people is more important than what those people can do for you. He is the voice that keeps gently correcting Rick when Rick's exhaustion drives him towards something harder and less generous. He is the philosophical counterbalance to Shane, to the governor, to every version of the argument that survival justifies whatever it requires. Herschel's death, the specific way he dies at the governor's hands, decapitated in front of the people who loved him, is the show's most deliberate act of counter-argument. It does not try to make his death inspirational. It is horrifying and unjust and leaves Rick kneeling in the dirt, unable to process it. But the show does not then conclude that Herschel's philosophy was wrong. It concludes that the world is often wrong, and that the people in it have to decide anyway what they're going to believe and how they're going to act. Herschel's death does not disprove his arguments. It demonstrates the cost of them, which is not the same thing. Morgan's arc in the later seasons is the show's most explicit philosophical examination of mercy as a principle, and it is examined specifically as a stress test. Morgan arrives at Alexandria with a commitment to non-violence that has been refined almost to a point of abstraction. All life is precious is not just a sentiment for Morgan, it is a governing principle, one he has built his entire psychological recovery on, one he holds to with a rigidity that makes it almost impossible to live alongside him. He cannot kill even when killing is clearly necessary. He cannot make the calculations that survival in this world requires. His commitment to mercy has become so absolute that it has ceased to function as a practical philosophy and has become something more like a compulsion. The show handles Morgan with a lot of patience and genuine affection, and I think it earns that affection, even when Morgan is making things more difficult for everyone around him. He is the show's portrait of what happens when a person rebuilds themselves around a single principle after a breakdown. The principle holds everything together, which means the principle cannot be questioned, which means eventually the world has to do the questioning for you. Morgan's eventual compromise is painful, precisely because the principle was real. It was not just stubbornness, it was the structure he lived inside. Rick's version of mercy is not Morgan's version. Rick's mercy is not absolute. It is not a rule he applies without reference to context. It is a default orientation toward trying, toward opening the circle, toward extending grace, that he has to work against sometimes when the circumstances require it. The difference between Rick and Morgan, at their respective philosophical extremes, is the difference between mercy as a practice and mercy as an ideology. Practices are flexible, ideologies are brittle. Morgan eventually breaks. His absolute commitment to non-violence shatters under the weight of the world, and what comes out the other side is someone who has to rebuild a philosophy from scratch. Rick's version of mercy, which was never absolute, does not break in the same way. It bends. It costs him. There are periods where he loses sight of it entirely, where the world has pushed him so far that the mercy orientation that characterizes him at his best simply is not available. But he keeps coming back to it. That is the show's argument about mercy. Not that it is easy or costless or always available, but that the capacity for it is what makes Rick Grimes, and that the effort to return to it after the moments where it is lost is the most significant thing he does. He used the word explicitly in his speech at the end of the war with the Saviors. He stood in front of people who had every emotional reason to want the blood of the defeated, and he said the word out loud, and he chose it, and he bore the cost of choosing it. That is the most philosophically definitive moment of his arc. Not the violence, which is spectacular and frequent and the thing that people remember. The word, the practice, the choice made under duress, that is harder than any of the violence ever was. A future without grace is just a longer form of the end of the world. Rick Grimes understood that. It is what he built toward, imperfectly and at enormous cost, from the moment he put down Bicycle Girl in the park, all the way to the moment he spared the man who had made the last several years of his life a sustained catastrophe. The practice is the argument, the choice is the statement, and the statement is, this is what we are building. This is what it looks like. This is what it costs. Rick Grimes loses more people than almost any other character in the show, and that is not incidental. The losses are structural. They are not just tragedy for its own sake, not just the show demonstrating its willingness to kill characters in order to prove it has stakes. The losses are the mechanism through which the show tests and reshapes Rick's philosophy. Every significant death in Rick's orbit produces a version of Rick who believes something slightly different than he did before, who has updated his understanding of what the world requires, what is possible, what is worth protecting, what can be survived. There is a specific thing grief does to a philosophy. It does not simply damage it, it tests it at the load-bearing points. It forces the question of whether what you believed before the loss is sufficient to organise your life around after. Some beliefs survive, some do not. The ones that do not either get replaced by something harder or leave a gap that gets filled by something worse. The ones that do are revealed, by surviving, to be genuinely foundational. Not convenient positions held in comfortable circumstances, but actual commitments that can bear weight. Laurie's death is the first catastrophic test. She dies in childbirth in the prison, in an episode that does not give Rick time to be there for it, and the show handles the immediate aftermath with a specific and honest kind of restraint. He walks into the room and he knows before anyone tells him. The scene where he receives the news, where he processes it, where he falls, where the sound that comes out of him is not quite crying and not quite anything else, is one of the most genuinely devastating moments the show produces, and it is devastating specifically because it is not performed. It is just a man whose understanding of what the world contains has been irrevocably altered. What follows is a period of profound dysfunction that the show takes seriously. Rick starts receiving phone calls from the dead. He hallucinates Laurie. He cannot perform the basic functions of leadership in the way the group needs him to. He is, in clinical terms, experiencing a grief response of the kind that impairs function, and the show presents this not as weakness but as honest depiction of what happens when a person absorbs a loss of that magnitude without the tools to process it. His framework did not have a contingency plan for this. He believed, without having to articulate it, that Laurie would be there, that the family unit that gave his leadership its purpose would survive. And when it did not, the whole architecture wobbled. He comes back from it. Not completely, not cleanly, but enough to function. And what he comes back as is slightly different, slightly more closed, slightly more oriented toward the immediate and the practical, slightly less willing to leave himself open to the specific vulnerability that losing Laurie produced. Grief as a philosophical engine does not always move you toward warmth and openness. Sometimes it moves you toward walls. Herschel's death is different in kind. It is the loss of Rick's moral counselor, the external voice that represented the philosophical commitments Rick most wanted to maintain, when his own strength to maintain them ran low. Losing Herschel is not just the loss of a person, it is the loss of the function that person served. It is losing the voice that was always gently correcting you, always insisting on the value of trying, always making the argument for mercy and hope, and the belief that what you build matters. After Herschel dies, Rick has to make those arguments entirely from his own internal resources. There is no longer anyone to remind him of them when he forgets. And that is a specific kind of loneliness that is different from ordinary grief. It is the loneliness of suddenly having to hold up a position that someone else used to help you hold. Herschel was the person who said the hopeful thing when Rick could not find the hopeful thing. When Herschel is gone, Rick has to find it alone. He does not always manage to. The record of his attempts after Herschel's death is inconsistent, sometimes failing badly, but the point is that he keeps trying to make an argument that he now has to make without the person who is best at making it. Glenn's death is horror in the most precise sense of that word. It is not ambiguous. It is not redeemable by meaning or narrative function. The show stages it to ensure that the experience of watching it is itself part of the argument about what Negan's kind of power actually does to people, what it takes from them, what it leaves behind. Rick is present. He is on his knees in the dirt watching, unable to act. He is forced by the threat to Carl to hold himself still through something that should not be survivable. That experience of witnessing and being unable to stop it creates an obligation. A witness has been made. Rick cannot unsee it or unfeel it, or find a philosophical framework that makes it smaller. Carl's death is in a category by itself, for reasons that go beyond the emotional devastation. Though the emotional devastation is real, and the show handles it with unusual care. Carl is the future, not in a symbolic or rhetorical sense, but in the most concrete possible sense. Rick is surviving in order to build something, and the thing he is building is a world that Carl can live in. When Carl dies, the immediate grief is enormous, but there is something underneath it that is philosophically distinct from the other losses. It is the sudden absence of the reason that organised everything else. Rick survives to build something for Carl, and now Carl is not there to build it for. And the question is whether the vision Carl described can become its own reason, detached from the person who articulated it. Whether a man can carry a dead child's dream far enough to make it real, even without the child there to see it happen. That is the thing about grief as a philosophical force. It does not take things from you and then stop. It keeps working. It adds things. Weight, obligation, the specific shape of what is missing. It is not a subtractive process. It is an additive one. And what it adds is harder to carry than what it removed was easy to hold. Rick carries his dead. The show demonstrates this in the occasional references, the moments where a memory surfaces, the way grief resurfaces in unexpected contexts and has to be absorbed again. It does not allow him to simply process a loss and move on. The losses accumulate, and they are all present simultaneously. Laurie and Herschel and Glenn and Carl and others, all of them still there, still exerting weight, still shaping how he sees the decisions in front of him. He kept going. That is the only thing that needs to be said about Rick Grimes and grief. He kept going, not without cost, not unchanged, not as the same person who went in, but he kept going, and the grief kept working on him. And what it produced, slowly, imperfectly, with enormous resistance, was someone who understood from the inside what loss feels like, who had been made by the accumulation of losses to care about what it means to protect people from losing what they love, who had been changed by grief in the direction of mercy rather than away from it. That is not inevitable. Grief can move in many directions. It can produce hardness and closure, and the decision to stop caring so that caring can never hurt you again. Rick has moments where it moves him that way. But overall, the arc of grief in his story is not toward hardness, but towards something more complicated, a kind of earned seriousness, a weight that is always present but that has been organised into something that functions rather than something that collapses. The fact that these deaths cost him something, every time, without exception, is the show's evidence that he remains human throughout. Even in the terminus period, even in the aftermath of Carl, even when the world has done its worst, the losses still register. He still carries them. That is the argument. Picture Rick Grimes on a bridge. He is alone. He is injured. There are rebar wounds. There is blood. There is a horse that is gone, and a herd that is behind him and is not stopping. In front of him across the river are the people he has spent the last year trying to build something with. The bridge is there because he built it, not just as infrastructure, though it is that too, an actual working bridge connecting actual communities, but as a philosophical statement about what he believes the world can be. He has spent the last several months trying to prove that communities can cooperate, that the people who survived this far can choose to build something together rather than continuing to fight for territory and dominance. The bridge is the physical form of that argument. And now the herd is going to cross it and wipe out everything. Rick has been having visions as he moves across the bridge. Shane is there, and Herschel and Sasha, the dead, visiting him, which the show has used before to mark the moments when Rick is closest to the edge between surviving and not. He is bleeding out and holding on to consciousness through will rather than anything the biology supports, and the dead are showing up to walk with him. And the thing about the version of this scene that the show actually gives us is how quiet it is, emotionally. Rick is not terrified. He is not raging against the dying of the light. He is just a man who can see what needs to happen and is moving toward it, as he has always moved toward the things that need doing, without making a lot of noise about it. He spots a detonator. There is dynamite near the bridge supports. If he sets it off, the bridge goes, the herd is stopped, and the communities on the other side survive. He does it without hesitation, because after everything, after all of it, Rick Grimes is still the man who came back to put down Bicycle Girl in the park. He still believes that some things are worth doing even when they cost everything. He still believes that what the people on the other side of the river have been building together is worth protecting at whatever price the protection requires. He has not lost that. The world spent 9 seasons trying to take it from him, and it did not take it. The bridge is Rick's thesis made physical. He built it to say, we can be more than just survivors. We can be people who make things for each other, who create infrastructure that serves everyone, rather than just those who control it, who choose cooperation over dominance. And then he destroys it to save it, which is philosophically peculiar and exactly right. He destroys the bridge so that what the bridge represents can continue. The object goes, but the argument survives. The season that leads to the bridge is, I think, underrated. It is slower than the seasons before it, and less obviously dramatic, and people who were watching for the violence found it frustrating. But what it is doing is showing you Rick Grimes trying to build something after Carl, after the war, after everything. And the thing he is trying to build is not a fortress. It is a network, communities that trade with each other, that share resources, that are connected by physical infrastructure that required cooperation to construct. He is arguing with concrete and timber and labour agreements that the future Carl described is not just a nice idea, but something you can actually build. The saviour workers who are involved in the construction represent a test of that argument in real time. They were the enemy. They were part of the system that killed Glenn and Abraham and made the last 2 years of everyone's life a sustained nightmare. And Rick is asking the communities to work alongside them, to treat them as people who can be integrated rather than as a threat to be contained. Some people around him think this is naive. Some people around him think it is the right call, but find it extremely difficult to execute. None of it is easy. But Rick keeps making the argument in the only language he has left, which is action. He shows up to the bridge every day. He does the work. He demonstrates that what he is asking from other people is something he is willing to do himself. There is something worth sitting with in the image of Rick Grimes on a construction site. This is a man who spent years with a gun in his hand, who has fought his way through more situations than most fictional characters are given in a lifetime, who has been the protagonist of some of the most extreme circumstances the show could devise. And the most important thing he does in his final season is go to work. Show up. Build something. The heroism at the end of Rick Grimes' story is not spectacular. It is patient and physical and unglamorous, which is, when you think about it, exactly what the show has been arguing heroism is all along. There is something worth thinking about in the idea that Rick's most heroic act is an act of destruction. He does not win the final battle with his group around him. He does not deliver a speech that rallies everyone to a victory. He stands alone on something he built, and he destroys it, and he goes into the river with it. That is the form the heroism takes, and it is the right form, because it is completely consistent with who he has always been. Someone who does the right thing at personal cost, without performing the cost, without waiting to see if anyone noticed. The helicopter complicates things. Rick does not die. He is taken by Jadis and a mysterious group, the CRM, in the show's expanded mythology, and the series preserves him in a way that is both a production necessity and a philosophical wrinkle. He intended to die for something. The fact that he lived does not retroactively change what he was willing to do. Intent and outcome are not the same thing. A sacrifice that is survived is still a sacrifice. The willingness to give everything is not conditional on actually losing everything. Rick stood on that bridge and chose. The helicopter intervening afterward does not undo the choice. What the time jump reveals, the older Judith, the changed world, the communities continuing, is that what Rick built survived, not perfectly, not without cost and conflict, and the ongoing difficulty of maintaining things that are worth maintaining. But the people on the other side of the river kept going. The cooperative structure he spent his last months constructing did not collapse the moment he was gone. The argument he had been making, with varying success, across 9 seasons of television, had been heard by enough people and taken seriously enough that it continued without him. He built the bridge. He stood on the bridge. He burned the bridge. And the people he did it for walked through the world he made possible. That is the sentence the show earns through 9 seasons of Rick Grimes' story. Not everything it earned, not everything it should have been able to say, but that much is genuinely there, genuinely earned, genuinely true to what the show was doing at its best. The Ones Who Live, the spin-off that brings Rick back years later, is a different story with a different set of concerns. And this script is not really the place for it. But it is worth noting that his survival is not incidental or accidental in the larger shape of his story. He went on the bridge having made peace with dying. He came back having been given the chance to keep trying. And the show's final word on him, in whatever form that word eventually takes, will presumably be about someone who never stopped choosing mercy, who never stopped making the argument, who never put down the badge even in a world where the institution it represented had ceased to exist. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So here is what I keep coming back to after all of this. After the badge and the prison and the bridge and the grief. After the governor and Negan and the claimers and Terminus. After Shane in the field and Glenn in the dirt and Herschel by the fence and Carl in the church. After everything the show put Rick Grimes through across 9 seasons of television, here is the thing that I find genuinely worth sitting with. He did not become Negan. That sounds simple. It sounds like the minimum possible statement of success. Surely the bar is higher than simply not becoming the thing you are fighting against. But the more you think about everything the show did to Rick Grimes over the course of its run, the more remarkable it is that he came through it on the right side of that line. The world that The Walking Dead constructs is one that is specifically designed to produce Negans. It rewards ruthlessness. It punishes openness. It kills the people you love in order to teach you that caring is expensive. It presents, over and over, evidence for the proposition that the only honest response to a brutal world is to become brutal in return. And Rick Grimes kept refusing that proposition. Imperfectly, inconsistently, at enormous cost, but repeatedly, and in the end definitively, he kept refusing it. That refusal is what the show is actually about, underneath everything. The first thing Rick Grimes' story teaches us is that identity is not fixed, but it is also not arbitrary. Rick Grimes, at the end of his time in the main series, is a fundamentally different person than he was when he woke up in that hospital in the pilot. His understanding of the world is different. His tolerance for violence is different. His relationship to authority and institution and the social structures he used to believe in has been completely transformed. He is not the sheriff's deputy from King County, Georgia, not in any sense that a stranger who knew him before would immediately recognize. But he is also not someone without continuity. There is a through line. There is a Rick Grimes in the pilot and a Rick Grimes in Season 9, and they are recognizably the same person even across the gulf of everything that happened in between. The through line is not personality, it is not style, it is commitment. He is always someone who thinks that the way you treat other people is the most important thing. Everything else changes. That does not. What I find most striking about this, having spent a lot of time thinking about it, is that the show does not present this continuity as a triumph of willpower or moral discipline. It is not that Rick Grimes is a better or more virtuous person than Shane or the governor or any of the other people who broke under the same pressures. It is that something in his original formation was robust in ways that other people's formations were not. The commitment was genuine enough and specific enough and rooted deeply enough in who he actually was rather than in who he wanted to be seen as, that it did not collapse when the conditions that supported it collapsed. That is both a character argument and a philosophical one, about what makes values durable versus brittle, and about whether durability is something you choose or something that was already there in the way a thing was made. The second thing is that community is a philosophy, not a location. Rick builds communities across the series. He loses them and builds again. The Atlanta camp, the farm, the prison, Alexandria, the alliance of communities that the bridge was meant to serve. None of these survive in the form Rick built them, or at least none survive without radical transformation. What survives is not any specific place or group, but the idea underlying all of them, that people are better together than apart, and that together requires rules worth choosing, and that the rules worth choosing are the ones that treat people as ends rather than means. He carries that idea from location to location, rebuilding it in whatever physical form the current circumstances allow, losing it and finding it again. The third thing is that grief does not break philosophy, it tests it. Rick loses the most important people in his life repeatedly, and every time he has to decide whether what he believed before the loss is still worth believing. The show's quiet argument is that yes, it is, but not because it's comfortable or rewarded, but because the alternative is to become someone who has put down the weight, and in doing so has become less than what he was. Grief is the mechanism through which his philosophy is tested at its load-bearing points, and the load-bearing points hold, not without damage, not without the marks that come from weight being applied. But they hold. The fourth thing is that mercy is the hardest and most necessary thing. Not kindness, mercy. The active, deliberate, costly choice to extend grace beyond what is owed. Rick is not consistent at this. The show does not pretend he is. There are periods where the mercy orientation that characterizes him at his best is simply not available, where the world has ground him down to something that cannot access it. But he keeps coming back to it. After every period of hardness, after every time the world has pushed him toward the Negan model of pure power and no grace, he finds his way back. The repetition of return is the argument. Not that mercy is always wise or always available, but that the capacity for it is what makes the future worth building toward. The fifth thing is that what you build matters, even when it is taken from you. The prison was destroyed. The bridge was blown up. Every specific thing Rick made was eventually dismantled or lost or transformed into something he did not design. And the communities survived. The children grew up. The world changed imperfectly and slowly because some people believed it was worth trying and kept trying even when the evidence was against them. You can measure what Rick built in the structures themselves and conclude that he failed repeatedly. Or you can measure it in the people who kept going because of what he modelled for them, and the answer is different. Think about what the badge actually meant in the end, not the institution it represented. That was gone before the pilot was over. Not the law it was supposed to enforce. There was no law left to enforce, but the underlying commitment the badge was a symbol of, the agreement to stand between people and whatever threatens them, at personal cost, without requiring gratitude or reciprocity or the guarantee of survival. That commitment did not require the institution. It turned out to be older and more durable than the institution it had been housed in. Rick Grimes carried it into a world that had destroyed everything the institution was built on, and it survived. Because it was his, not the badge's, his. There is a version of this analysis that would try to identify the precise moment where Rick's philosophy crystallizes into its final form, the exact speech or scene or choice that represents the philosophical conclusion of his arc. But that is the wrong way to look at it. Rick Grimes does not arrive at a conclusion. He is always in the middle of the argument. Every choice he makes is another iteration of the same ongoing negotiation between what the world requires and what he believes. And the negotiation never ends because the world never stops presenting new requirements, and the beliefs never stop being tested by them. The philosophical project is not completed, it is sustained. That is genuinely worth sitting with. Not the idea of a hero who arrives at wisdom and stops changing, but the idea of a person who keeps choosing, who keeps making the same basic argument in the face of all the evidence the world can produce against it, who keeps going even when going requires carrying more than any reasonable person should have to carry. He is not a perfect man, he is not a perfect leader, he is not a philosopher in any formal sense. He is a man who tried under conditions specifically designed to make trying impossible, and kept trying, and the show, at its best, treats this as something genuinely worth documenting. The badge is gone. The wedding ring is gone. The hospital hallway is 12 seasons behind him. The world he woke up into looks nothing like the world he went to sleep in, and the world he has built looks nothing like the world he started trying to build. But the thing underneath all of it, the commitment, the belief that the way people treat each other is the most important thing, the stubborn insistence that something is worth building even in the ruins, is still there. It was always there. It is still there. By any reasonable measure, what Rick Grimes did with that belief is extraordinary. He throws his arms wide over the river. That is the last image of Rick Grimes on the main show. His arms out, the river below him, the explosion coming, and he looks, not afraid, not triumphant, just settled, just a man who has made a choice he was always going to make. Because he has always been the kind of person who comes back, who returns to the thing that needs doing, who picks up what has been put down and carries it the rest of the way. He woke up in a hospital hallway in rural Georgia with a badge clipped to his shirt and a wedding ring on his finger, and he spent 12 years deciding what those objects meant. In a world that had ceased to support the things they originally represented, he decided they meant something. He kept deciding it over and over every time the world argued against him. He decided it when Laurie died, and when Herschel was taken, and when Glenn was murdered, and when Carl was lost. He decided it on the bridge, alone, with the herd behind him, and the people he loved across the water. And then a helicopter came. He did not die on that bridge. He went somewhere else for a while. And there is something quietly comforting about that, in a particular way, not because it erases the weight of what happened there, but because a man who spent 9 seasons arguing that it is worth trying deserves, at minimum, the chance to keep trying. His story is not finished. It has not been resolved into something neat and complete, and finally concluded. He is still out there, somewhere in the expanded universe of The Walking Dead, carrying the same things he has always carried, making the same argument he has always made. We are the ones who live. That is what The Walking Dead was about, underneath everything. Not the dead, which are a backdrop, not the violence, which is a consequence, not the politics or the geography or the specific communities that rise and fall across 11 seasons of television. It was about the question of what it means to stay human, what it costs, whether the cost is worth it. And Rick Grimes was the show's primary evidence for the argument that yes, the cost is worth it, that even in a world specifically designed to make humanity expensive and survival the only currency that matters, the choice to remain human is possible and meaningful, and the thing worth organising your life around. He carried the badge into a world where it meant nothing, and he made it mean something again. That is the whole story. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.